nap. It was one of those really good ones. Like, have you tried turning it off and turning it on again kind of naps? That was really great. I fell asleep at 6 a.m. this morning rather than last night, I guess. So I only had 2 hours of sleep. So it's good to be semi well rested. You need to be kind of well rested in order to be able to go over things like this, to delve into scientific evidence. The secular world likes to suggest, likes to teach that science and the Bible are opposites. That science and theology are opposites. But it really couldn't be farther from the truth. And there's a reason that they believe that science and the Bible are opposites. They'll say you can't prove God with science. And that's partially true. See, science is defined as the study by observation of the natural world. God falls into the category of the supernatural, that is, which is beyond what is natural. So science cannot study God. We can't observe him, but we can observe his effects. We can look at the world that he's created and draw conclusions concerning him. And even more so, we can see how his people behaved and what his people did, and show that they had insight that they should not have had. Insight that we didn't have until the last 1,000 years, and in most cases until the last couple hundred years. It really is quite amazing. But I will start with this. How do we know that God exists? I suggest that the place to start is the first law of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics is simply energy can neither be created nor destroyed. The law of conservation of energy is similar. Matter can neither be created or destroyed. There's a problem here. Those who are atheistic believe that God doesn't exist, but they'll believe that these laws of the universe are fundamentally true. If energy cannot be created, and matter cannot be created, how is it here? We only have two options. Either the universe is eternal, or there is an eternal force outside of the universe which put it here. So is the universe eternal? Well, science disproves that rather clearly. Because we have observed the expansion of space. Space is actively expanding, which means it had a starting point. It's expanding from somewhere. So it's not eternal because it has a starting point. And it's also slowing down, which means it'll have an end. It's not eternal. So if the universe is not eternal and matter can neither be created nor destroyed, neither can energy, the only other option is that there is a force outside of the universe that works outside of its laws that put everything here. That is the only other option. And I would challenge anybody else to try to find another option that cannot be disproven by science as it is. But the Bible is truly filled with scientific thought. It's not necessarily put in a scientific manner. But certain things in the Bible are described that were not proven by science to have existed until quite recently, comparatively speaking. For example, you've heard of the water cycle. Follow me to Ecclesiastes, Ecclesiastes chapter 1. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 7. It says, "All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, they will flow there again." That's the English Standard Version. There we are. From where the rivers come, thither they will return again. And then in Ecclesiastes chapter 11, verse 3, talks about the clouds full of rain that they empty upon the earth, and where the tree falls, there it shall be. But Ecclesiastes chapter 7, my mind's gone blank. Chapter 1, verse 7. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 7. It says, the rivers run into the sea, but the sea isn't full, and the water that goes into the sea goes back to where it started. That's the water cycle. It's very clearly the water cycle. It's somebody is observing somehow that this water is flowing from the mountains into the rivers, from the rivers into the sea, and then from the sea somehow going back over to here. And it talks about how it does so in Ecclesiastes chapter 11. It's through the clouds. The fascinating thing about that is that the water cycle was not discovered until 1580 AD by a man named Bernard Palissy. I think I'm saying that right. Well, his name was Bernard, and that's not a name that you find very far back. So the water cycle is one such scientific example of foreknowledge, things that they should not have known, but did. Spoken of in one of the more ancient books. Another comes from Job. Job chapter 38. 38 verse 16. It says, has thou entered into the springs of the sea? Or hast thou walked in search of the depth? The springs of the sea. It's just one verse. It's very small. But it tells so much. There are underneath the ocean springs of water that come up. I'm losing my place all of a sudden. Here we are. In 1984, Times Magazine posted this concerning a new discovery. It said 3 mineral-rich hot springs have been discovered near the middle of the Atlantic Ocean floor. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration reported this today. While several such springs have been found under the Pacific, only one was previously discovered under the Atlantic. It wasn't until the 1900s, the late 1900s, that we found these springs underneath the ocean. Springs of water that are heated up by the mantle coming up underneath from the ocean floor. We did not have the technology in the days of Job to go down and look. We did not have the technology in the days of Job to build a submarine and observe these things. But he says, they're there. Have you seen them? And of course the point is, I've not seen them. But God knows that they're there. God can go and visit them. And similarly, it talks about in Job the valleys in the ocean floor, the trenches in the ocean floor. We didn't reach the bottom of the ocean until 1977. We had no way of even knowing that there were trenches on the ocean floor. But here in Job, they're spoken of. What about the earth? What about concerning the earth? Have you ever looked at how it is that the ancients described how the earth stood? Some describe it as it being this one solid thing. You had hell, then you had earth, and then you had heaven. Kind of like a sandwich, an earth sandwich. Others described it, there is a man who was standing on something, and he held the earth on his shoulders. That was the Greek myth of Atlas. That's where we get that term Atlas. When it is that we went into space, we were able to see that it was not the case that some giant man was holding the earth, or that it was all one solid mass. There is hell, earth, and heaven, and that's all there was. We saw that it was suspended on nothing. Suspended on nothing, which is an interesting way of putting it, concerning that Job chapter 26. Job chapter 26, verse 7, says the same thing. It says, he stretched out the north over the empty place, and hangeth the earth upon nothing. How could Job possibly have known that the earth is floating there in space? We didn't know that until the last 100 years. And this is small, a small sampling. There was another one concerning Psalms chapter 8. Psalms chapter 8 talks about an interesting phrase, paths of the sea. If you've ever heard of a man named Matthew Fontaine Murray, you'll know him as one of the fathers of oceanography. He was an American naval officer and oceanographer, and he was a Christian who loved reading his Bible. He entered into the U.S. Navy in 1825, although an accident had disabled him, so he left active sea duty. And at one point, he overheard in his Bible studies, Psalm chapter 8, the phrase, whatsoever passeth through the paths of the sea. And Murray decided that he was going to try to see if what God was saying was true, if it was accurate. Were there paths in the sea? And he studied thousands of old ship logs, and from these he compiled charts of ocean and wind currents. They showed the speed and the direction of the ocean currents, and he set adrift weighted bottles known as drift bottles, and they floated slightly below the surface of the water, so they weren't affected by wind, and he found that they were carried by these currents, these consistent currents, these pathways in the ocean. And these shipping lanes are still used today. After it is that he found them, the news of them spread rather wide, and expeditions to various different places was cut by as much as a month. He found pathways in the ocean. Oceanography wasn't even a thing back in Job's time. It's argued as to whether or not they even had ships back in Job's time. But here it is, Job is talking about the pathways of the sea. And sure, I suppose that some of these things, especially in Job, it could be argued, well, they're probably just poetic. But isn't it strange that these things that are supposed to be poetic can be explained in a scientific manner? Hangs the earth out on nothing. Earth is suspended in space. It's resting literally on nothing. Paths of the sea, trenches on the ocean floor, the springs of the sea, all of these things we have found. From the pure scientific view, there's a lot here, but medically speaking, there's even more. In Numbers 19:12, they were taught to avoid communicable disease from dead bodies. The principle of quarantine, which did not come about until about 1000 A.D., put in place by a man named Ibn Sina, who was born in 980 A.D. There is the principle of quarantine. Deuteronomy chapter 23 talks about the necessity of human waste disposal outside of camp, buried in the earth. And then we might laugh and think, well, no, duh. But you have to remember that back in the time of the New Testament, we still had people throwing their waste into the streets of their cities. People didn't know, nor did they care. But thousands of years before them, there was somebody telling these nomadic people, hey, when you're stopped in camp, even though it is you're not going to be here forever, even though it is you're going to up and move, keep it away from you. The optimum time for circumcision surgery in Leviticus chapter 12, verse 3 is another. It says that a child is to be circumcised on the 8th day after they're born. Hematology, which was founded in 1946, has taught us that on the 8th day after a child is born, the vitamin K count is the highest it will ever be in a child's life. up to 110%, 20% higher than it was the day before and 10% higher than it will ever be. And that buildup of vitamin K allows for a better clotting. How did they figure that out, if not given by God? I don't think that very many people were in the habit of making children bleed and trying to figure out what day of the week they were best they best recovered from it. Considering the Old Testament, in times where I've been up here before, I've talked to you about the reason that God gave the commandments to the Israelites. Why it is that He gave the Old Testament to the Jews. And the reason was because He had promised to Abraham, He promised that the coming Savior would come through their bloodline. And He promised Jacob, the coming Savior will come through your bloodline. And Jacob's name was changed to Israel. And so the rules and regulations that He put into place were to ensure preservation of that bloodline. Were to ensure that they would be safe. Safe from communicable disease, safe from all these things. Warning them that blood is the key to life, when just at the beginning of our current country, the first president that we had died due to a practice of bloodletting. The idea that if we drain enough of the sick blood, they'll recover from their fever. But here it is, we have the Bible saying blood is the key to life. Among the list of things that God had given to the Jews, among the list of various regulations that He gave to them, included rules for consumption, what it is that they were allowed to eat. And it seems at first glance to be a bit arbitrary. They have clean and unclean animals, ones with cloven hooves. That if they were going to eat animals from the ocean that were from underwater, that they had to have fins and scales. They weren't allowed to eat reptiles, and they weren't allowed to eat bats. Why? I promise I have it here. In Leviticus chapter 11, the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, the animals which you may eat among all the animals that are on the earth, among the animals, whatever divides the hoof, having cloven hooves, and chewing the cud, you may eat." And several unclean animals were studied. However, they showed significantly higher levels of toxicity and much lower levels of seedling growth. Seedlings and meat juice from pigs grew only about 45 or 54% as often as a group control. They took seeds and they placed them in the juices from these animals. And they measured to see how well they would survive. And if they did survive at all, how well they grew. In pigs, which are an unclean animal, 54%, only 54% grew. In rabbit, 49%, in camel, 41%, and in horse, 39%. The results for these larger animals suggested that the biblical division between clean and unclean could have been related to the toxicity of the juices from these animals. And a similar research was done on birds. Clean birds, such as the pigeon and quail, grew seedlings to 93% of them still grew, and 89% in others. While those from unclean birds, such as the red-tailed hawk, only grew 36%, and the owl only 62%. They were much more toxic. Is that just a coincidence? God told them, or somehow they figured out, I guess if you're looking from the outside the Christian perspective, somehow they decided, seemingly arbitrarily, these things are clean and these things are unclean. And then when we go and we study them with modern science, we see there's a difference. There's an actual, genuine difference between these things. Considering things that grow in the ocean that don't have fish or scales, when eaten, they pose a danger. I'm sure all of us have either have experienced or know somebody who has experienced becoming ill through eating bad shrimp. Bad shrimp or things along the lines of other shellfish. Blowfish also included. And reptiles were not allowed to be eaten. Reptiles carry salmonella. And bats carry rabies and apparently COVID-19, it would seem. And God said that you're not to eat these animals. You're not to eat these animals. They're unclean. And when we look at them, again, under today's scientific scrutiny, there's actually a difference between the unclean and the clean and whether or not which ones are more safe to eat. But how did they know? We have no way of showing how does they know. The Old Testament is full of these things. One of my favorites is the water of purification. When looking at it, it seems almost like it's just a hodgepodge of superstitious potion making. They say you take the ashes of a cow and you mix in hyssop, you mix in cedar wood and a material called scarlet, most likely scarlet wool. And that this potion, you were to use it to wash somebody who had touched a dead body. And it sounds like somebody, a Wiccan perhaps, had put this together and said this will ward off the evil spirit so you don't get sick. But when we put it under scientific scrutiny, things start to make sense. But historically speaking, they stop making sense. So let's look at looking at the ingredients individually. First, consider the ashes. There's a chemical known as lye, which is one of the main ingredients in a lot of soaps today. And in fact, lye in high concentrations is extremely caustic. And it's very irritating to the skin, but in diluted concentration, it's used as an exfoliant and a cleansing agent. Various lye soap recipes reveal that to obtain lye, water is poured through ashes. The water retrieved from pouring it through ashes contains a concentration of the chemical. And Moses instructed the Israelites to prepare a mixture that would have included lye mixed with a diluted solution, and it would have been ideal for stopping the spread of germs. But it doesn't stop there. What about the other ingredients for this water purification? Hyssop contains the antiseptic thymol, the same ingredient that we find today in some brands of mouthwash. Cedar wood has been used for a long time in storage cabinets for the ability to repel insects and also to prevent decay. And cedar oil, when applied to humans, it's an antiseptic, an astringent, an expectorant, and an antifungal, as well as a sedative and an insecticide. And the Israelites were again also instructed to toss in scarlet, likely wool, which would have made this essentially the ancient equivalent to lava soap. Looking at it under scientific scrutiny, what sounds like is a bunch of random items tossed together, it made something that would actually fight off disease. Something that could actually physically clean somebody who had touched a dead body. That's amazing. I don't know how you feel about it, but I think that's amazing. Antibacterial soap, a recipe for antibacterial soap from about 2000 BC. Absolutely amazing. And it's difficult to take this information and put it in a reasonable linear form. So it might seem a little bit scattered. But there's a lot of this information. There's a lot of it out there. Most of the information that I've grabbed, I've stolen from apologeticspress.com. I recommend you check it out. I recommend you look at it and see what it is that they have. And I recommend that you share it with others. This kind of information. This is the kind of information that captured my not imagination, but captured my attention when I was 15 years old. I was obsessed with science. I loved science. I was all for evolution. And I was shown these things. How the Bible follows science, and the Bible forces science to agree with it, and science is forced to agree with the Bible. I saw these things that everyone else is saying isn't true, that are proven to be true. And that's what convinced me. It might convince somebody that you know. I don't recommend necessarily sharing the video of me giving this information. Like I said, it's kind of a mash of seemingly random things, but all this information can be found rather easily. One last thing, just as an interesting note, the ark, Noah's ark. That's an incredible one. It really is. Aside from evidence that dinosaurs existed with men, if that is new to you, check that out. It's amazing. It absolutely is amazing. One of my favorites concerning that is evidence in what's called the Ta Prohm Temple. I'm trying to remember exactly where it is, but it was built. It was built Amino Domini. It was built after the death of Christ. It was built after the death of Christ, and there are all over it these carvings of animals, and one of them, if you were to show it to about any 8-year-old boy, he'll go, "That's a Stegosaurus." It's insane. How could they possibly have known what it looks like? Before I get too far into that, I'll stop there, and hopefully that's enough to get you to look for those things yourself. Again, Apologetics Press has a lot of that information. But considering the ark, if you've never been, I highly recommend going and seeing the ark that they built in Kentucky. It really is amazing to look at. But in Genesis chapter 6, verse 15, God instructed Noah, who likely lived in an area that wasn't anywhere near the ocean or a sea, to build an ark that was 300 cubits long, 50 wide, and 30 high. This ratio of 30 to 5 to 3, that length, breadth, and height, until about 1858, the ark was the largest floating ship ever created. And in terms that we understand better, the ark was about 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. In 1844, a man with the last name of Brunel, built his giant ship called the Great Britain. And he used the exact ratio, almost the exact ratio of the ark, the 50 to 5 to 3. And it turns out that these dimensions are the perfect ratio for building a huge boat for seaworthiness and not speed. If you wanted something that could float better than anything else, if you wanted something that could handle being tossed around by violent waves, this is the ratio that you use. And obviously the ark was not something that would be built for speed because it didn't have anywhere to go. And what's more, ship builders during the Second World War used the same ratio to build ships such as the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, which is one of the group of ships known as the Liberty ships, referred to as the Ugly Ducklings. A barge-like boat built to carry tremendous amounts of cargo, just like the ark. They used the exact same ratio. So how did Noah know that the perfect seagoing ratio was that 30 to 5 to 3? And how did he know to use that to build the ark? Brunel and others like him had several generations of shipbuilding's knowledge to use, but Noah's was the first of its kind. No one had done it before. And somehow he had this information that made it perfect. So either Noah was a genius before his time and a strange hobbyist, considering again where it is that they put Noah is nowhere near an ocean, or he had help. And the one who created this universe and the laws that govern it said, this is the perfect way to build it. 30 to 5 to 3. 30 to 5 to 3. It's absolutely amazing. I'm going to end this here in kind of an abrupt way. I really cannot stress how much of this information is out there. How much of it. This is a very small portion. I printed these off, and there was a bunch I couldn't. I ran out of paper. I ran out of paper in my printer, and so I couldn't print off more. There are whole books written on it. There are thousands of different papers, tons of different information from all different areas of study, all which show that the Bible is true. There are people that we know who don't believe. There are people who we know who think that science and the Bible are in opposition. I think it's time that we show them, we take this information to them, and we show them that God created science. God created the world that science observes, and His Word is not contradictory to it, but shows evidence for it. I don't imagine that there's too many people in here who need to respond to the invitation concerning whether or not you believe. But if there's anybody listening online, or if there is anybody here who I'm not aware of who perhaps was fading in their belief, and that in some of this they've been reminded of the truth of the Scripture, then you have the opportunity to respond to the invitation of Christ as we give it in a moment, to come forward to the front row, to ask for forgiveness or for prayers. Whatever it is that you need, I pray that you make it known, and I pray that you take this information with you as you go, and that it has done something to spark an interest, and that you will share that information with others. It's the kind of information that really changes minds. So whatever it is your need, please have it be made known while it is that we stand together and we sing the invitation song.
I'm in the way, the bright and shining way. I'm in the glory land way.